Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whatever it is to you in your part of the world today. This is a special episode, a pre-recorded episode, where we have a special guest that's dropping in to visit us from overseas. Mr. Philip Mantle will be here. Let's get Shay out here first. Hello, how are you?
Fabulous. How are you?
Your caffeine finally kick in?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Well, let's get Philip on, and we will get this thing going. Hey, Philip, how are you this afternoon?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm fine, thank you.
We were so glad to have you. Like we were talking about earlier, it's been a hard time getting you because of the time difference.
Yeah, well, it's my pleasure, and here we are.
Yes, I'm so glad we're
Absolutely.
here. So let's see. Tell everybody a little bit about yourself. I know that you're a publicist and that you've got a book, and you're kind of an expert on some things too.
Well, I wouldn't call myself an expert. I've been involved in this subject for quite some time, 40 plus years. I know I don't look that old, but I can assure you. So I've been a long-standing UFO researcher here in the UK. I began my investigations, my involvement back in 1980 when I joined a local UFO group. I live in the county of West Yorkshire in the north of England. And there was a local group simply called the Yorkshire UFO Society that was formed by two brothers, Mark and Graham Birdsall. And I joined that in 1980. And, been involved ever since, one way or another. My involvement gathered momentum as the years passed, got more involved, done a whole host of things down the years. And here I am all those years later, still trying to find those answers that eluded me way back in 1980. What I do now, I'm not a member of any UFO groups. I run my own publishing concern called Flying Disc Press. So I've published books by authors from many different parts of the world, including the UK and the US, of course. But also some of my own books that I've either written or co-authored. And since 2018, my colleague in the States, Dr. Irina Scott, she lives in Ohio, and myself, have been actively involved in investigating the 1973 Pascagoula alien abduction that involved Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker. And the results of our investigation, we've recently published in a book called Beyond Reasonable Doubt, the Pascagoula alien abduction. And we uncovered a whole mountain of new information and new witnesses. So that kind of brings us right up to date. That's where we are today. And still investigating, of course, that things haven't stopped. They've slowed down, but they haven't stopped.
Wow.
I think with the advent of technology too, and it seems that there's new awareness and openness, people are more willing to come out and talk too. Do you find that to be pretty much true?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I started, there was no internet. So communicating with people was usually either on the telephone or in writing and or in person, of course. And, in the 1990s, in 1994, I co-authored my first book, which is called Without Consent. It's a study of alien abduction cases here in the UK. And I co-authored it with a colleague of mine who was a journalist by the name of Carl Nagatis. And I literally traveled from one end of the UK to the other, interviewing people in person for that particular book. And the only place I didn't go was Northern Ireland. And that was all simply because I had no one to interview there. Otherwise, I would have got on the ferry and sailed across and gone. But I went to Scotland, Wales, throughout the UK. So it was different times. But like you said, today it's a different climate. And the technology that we're using now, would have been, if somebody ever told us back in 1980 when I started this, that I'd be promoting a book that I'd written with an academic in the United States, and we could communicate free of charge like this, face to face across the Atlantic, I would have fallen over with laughing, you know.
Mhm.
But nonetheless, here it is.
That's awesome.
Yeah, technology is good, and well, it can be now with AI. It can be good and bad. So tell us a little bit the abduction that you highlighted in the book. Sorry, I'm stumbling on my words here.
Pascagoula. Well, Pascagoula's in Mississippi.
That was going to try and I was I was in my head trying to form how to say that.
Yeah, it's right down on the Gulf Coast.
Mhm.
And back in 1973, October the 11th, 1973, two gentlemen, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker. Calvin was 18, almost 19. He was getting married in a few weeks' time. And Charles Hickson was a family friend. Now, Calvin wasn't from Pascagoula. He actually lived near Laurel in Mississippi, which I think is a couple of 100 miles away. But he was working long hours, and his fiance said, it'd be nice if you had a regular 9-to-5 job. I don't see much of you, and we're getting married soon. So his father said, why don't you ring Charlie? He was, a lifelong family friend. He's over in Pascagoula working in the shipyard. He may be able to get you a job. So Calvin did. Charlie said, yeah, we're hiring. Come on over. So he got him a job. The idea was that Calvin would live in Pascagoula with Charlie's family Monday to Friday, get him, go home on a weekend. He got a new car. Like I said, he was getting married. And once things he got established, maybe they'd find a place to rent or buy out there. So October the 11th, 1973 was Calvin's first day at work in the shipyard. And he was a welder. And, they worked all day. He was driving them home that evening after work. And the one thing that both gentlemen liked was fishing. They're both fishing nuts. And it was Charlie who said, do you want to do some fishing tonight, son? Oh, yeah. So they got some fishing gear, some bait, and Charlie's giving Calvin directions. Calvin didn't know this location, this area at all. And they drove down by the Pascagoula River. This is not out in the swamps, this is right next to Highway 90. It's a big bridge goes over the river. The shipbuilding still going on all around them. But it was a little place that was slightly off the beaten track. And they found themselves on an old pier. There was a shipyard had closed and the pier was still there. And as they drove in, they passed a sign that said no entry. And Calvin remarked on that. And Charlie says, don't take no notice. Don't worry about it, So they're fishing away. And this blue light comes from behind them and reflects off the water. Calvin's first reaction is, it's the police. We're going to spend the night in jail for trespassing, So they both turn around, and of course, it's not the police. There is this object. It's oval shaped. It's descending. It's got two very powerful bright lights on the left-hand edge. It stops a couple of feet above the ground, so it doesn't touch the ground at all. Next to these lights, this opening appeared, and the more intense bright light came out, so much so that they had to shield their eyes. And then three strange-looking creatures, humanoid creatures, literally floated out of this thing. They described them as being about 5 feet tall, head, no neck, pointed protrusions out of the side of the head, one out of the front, arms, hands were pincer-like. The legs never moved. The legs just stuck together. And they were described as gray-colored, but like the skin of elephants, gray and wrinkly. Two got hold of Charlie, one got hold of Calvin, and he said we were instantly paralyzed. We couldn't move. The only thing we could move was our eyes. They were taken towards this thing, in through the opening, Charlie to the right, Calvin to the left. Calvin said he was placed on a transparent table that was at an angle. This big ugly creature that he called them kind of stood back. And then from behind him came another being. She looked pretty much human, female. The only difference was she had very long middle fingers, very long. And she used these, she put these down Calvin's throat. This thing came out of the ceiling about the size of a mobile phone, went around him, making a clicking noise. His lower clothing and his shoes and socks were removed. He said they stuck something in his foot and it hurt. He felt like he was having the blood drained out of him. And, he was redressed, put back out onto the pier. Charlie just said, I was suspended. He wasn't on any table. He felt as if he was just suspended in midair. And this thing came out of the wall in front of him. He said it looked like a giant eyeball. And that went around him. He didn't see any other creatures like the female. And he was put back outside. And he says Calvin was standing there with his arms out as if he was in some kind of trance. And he shook him. He said, you all right, son? You all right? And he came around and they both turned around and this thing shot into the sky and was gone in the blink of an eye. Now, they were both literally terrified. Calvin more so. Charlie had been in the army and had fought in Korea and had been under fire in Korea. Their initial decision was, we're not going to tell anyone. They will think we're absolute nuts. Calvin was also getting married and his fiancée was only 16, so he had to have parental permission. He thought, my fiancée's father will never let me marry her if I come on with this crazy story, So they make their way back to the car, which is brand new, by the way. Charlie opens the passenger door and all the glass fell out. Calvin got in the driver's seat and he said it took him at least 20 times to start it. And eventually it started. So they were heading back home and Charlie had a change of heart. He says, no, we've got to tell somebody. What if these things come back and do this to somebody else? What if it's the start of an invasion? So they pulled in at a local store that had a payphone. No mobile phones in those days.
No.
They rang the nearby Air Force base. It's an Air Force base called Keesler. And they said, we're not in the UFO business anymore. Ring the authorities. So they rang the police. The police patched them through to Jackson County Sheriff's Office. And Charlie told them what had happened. They sent a car out and escorted them into town. And Calvin had said at this point, well, I'm going to say I passed out when these creatures came out. I don't want to be part of this. He didn't want to talk at all. He just wanted to go home. But anyway, they ended up in
real quick.
Yeah.
Now, was Calvin the one that got the thing stuck in his foot, or was that
Yes,
Charlie?
it was Calvin.
Okay.
Yeah,
Just making sure I'm on the right track here.
No, it's all right. I'll come to that in a moment. So they both interviewed separately by the sheriff and his deputies. That was Sheriff Fred Diamond. To be honest, they didn't really believe them, and they said, if you're cooking up this, you're going to be in big trouble, So they put them in a room together, and the deputy said, I'll be back in a few minutes. What they didn't know, there was a tape recorder playing in the desk next to them. So it recorded their conversation. The deputy came back in, took the tape out. They didn't know what was going on, took it out to the sheriff, and they replayed it. And of course, they're not laughing and joking. Calvin's literally crawling up the wall, and Charlie is not far behind him. So, the sheriff and his deputies then had a change of heart. And one of the deputies, several times down the years, who was there that night, Glenn Ryder, said if these gentlemen were acting, then they ought to go to Hollywood because they were that good, So they said, look, guys, you can go home. So they asked the sheriff not to say anything, and they said, no, we won't. So the next morning, they think, what are we going to do? We'll go to work. We won't tell anybody. We've told the authorities. We'll leave it at that. They go to work in the shipyard, and within minutes, they're summoned to the boss's office. And he said, what the hell have you two been up to? I've got journalists outside. The phone won't stop ringing. What's happened? So somehow the story had got out. The sheriff was there, and they blamed the sheriff, and he still said, no, we haven't said anything to anybody. So they told the boss what was going on. So the sheriff took them to the Singing River Hospital for a checkup. They were fine. And then someone mentioned radiation. The hospital couldn't check for that but Keesler Air Force Base could. So the sheriff rang the Air Force Base and they said, fetch him over. So they escorted them to Keesler Air Force Base, where they were checked with a Geiger counter and were fine. But the officer in charge said, well, while you're here, gents, why don't you come on in and tell us what happened last night? Kind of ironic, because that was the first place they phoned. So they went and sat down and they told them, unlike the sheriff's office, it wasn't recorded verbally, but they had a stenographer there. You know, the kind of thing you see in a courtroom. Mm-hmm. So again, the whole conversation was recorded by the stenographer, which we have a copy of. And it's unredacted, so there's all the officers' names that were there. Every word is there. I think it's about 17 pages long, and that's reproduced in full in our book, Beyond Reasonable Doubt.
Okay.
So again, you know, Calvin was reluctant to talk, so Charlie was like the torchbearer. And Calvin went back home after a couple of days. He ended up in hospital. He had a bit of a nervous breakdown, but he did get married. Charlie went on the chat show circuit. He went on the Dick Cavett show. And Calvin was supposed to go on with him, but he said no. They went on the Mike Douglas show. But Calvin said, I don't want no more to do with this. You know, I just want to, he'd got his life planned out, you know, got my fiance, get married, get a house, children, grandchildren, retire. Great. But that night changed all of that. So down the years, Charlie would tell his story. He published a book in 1983 called UFO Contact at Pascagoula that he co-authored with a chap called William Mendez. Occasionally, Calvin would pop up, usually at Charlie's insistence. So when I started flying this press, I obtained a copy of Charlie's book. Charlie died in 2011, and I got the rights to republish it because you can only buy a second-hand copy online, and they were charging astronomical prices for them. So I thought, that's not right. And I'd always had an interest in this case since I read about it in a magazine back in the 80s. So I set about looking for Calvin to see if I could get an interview with him. I thought, I'll just, if I can get an interview, I'll just put him in the back of this book to bring it up to date. Took me a few months, but I found him, got a phone number, spoke to him on the phone. He was very nice, but clearly didn't want to tell me anything, you know? Yeah. So we spoke a few times, and I said, why won't you give me an interview? He said, well, down the years, every time I gave an interview, it would always turn out wrong when they published it, you know? I said, well, the only way to get around that, Calvin, is let's do a book. You'd mentioned a book, and you can write it yourself. So nobody can change it. So we agreed that he would write and tell his story in full for the first time. But in the contract that we wrote up, I was not allowed to change one word of it. Now, even if he'd spelt it wrong, I had to leave it, you know. So he wrote Pascagoula, The Closest Encounter, that came out in 2018. Much to our amazement, it became an Amazon bestseller. So Calvin did some local media. He did some national and international media. He went to speak at a few conventions. But now the atmosphere had changed now. Back in 1973, everybody just laughed at them, called them, you know, drunken rednecks. But it's different now. You know, Calvin was treated with, treated positively. And the townsfolk of Pascagoula, by and large, accepted the story as part of the town's history. They didn't have to believe it, but it was part of the town's history. And in 2019, one of the local charities had saved up enough money to make a historical marker at the scene. And that's close to where the incident happened. And it's there. It was officially unveiled by the mayor. And I became very good friends with Calvin. We did a follow-up book. And that sold pretty well. He's in a documentary now on Netflix. There's a series on Netflix called Files of the Unexplained. It's an 8-part series. The first part of that series is Calvin Parker and the Pascagoula abduction. It's pretty good. Sadly, Calvin died last year. in August of last year. But Dr. Scott and I have been investigating things since we first started speaking with Calvin, because one way or another we learned that there were other witnesses, and we tracked them down, or they stepped forward. I mentioned Calvin's foot, and he had something stuck in it. Charlie also said when these creatures got hold of him, they pricked his arm. Now, I said to Calvin, have you got any photographs or documents or anything? He says, no. He says, our house was hit by Hurricane Katrina. It was under 10 or 12 feet of water. We lost everything. There was no photographs of their wedding, or Calvin and his family, of his young people. They were all gone. So one of my jobs was to hunt down any documentary evidence I could, documents, photographs, interview, anything. Well, of course, at the time in 1973, 2 days after the event, two people arrived on the scene. That was Dr. Alan Hynek, the Close Encounters man, and Dr. James Harder. Hynek formed the Center for UFO Studies, which is still going. So I contacted them. I said, this is what I'm working on. Have you got anything on this case? They sent me a PDF file. And in the middle of this PDF file is a one-page typewritten. So it's written on an old typewriter. And I know because I used to use them myself. And it's dated October the 13th, 1973. So it's 2 days after. And it describes Charlie and Calvin stripping down to their underwear and being given just a once-over, a visual. And it said he had found puncture wounds on Charlie's arm and on Calvin's foot. Bearing in mind, Calvin said they stuck something in my foot and it hurt. Charlie said they grabbed my arm and I felt a prick. But it also mentioned some photographs. Anyway, there were no photographs in this file, but I thought, well, this is interesting. And so I said to Calvin, who examined you? He said it was Dr. James Harder, because he'd arrived on the 13th, and that was one of the things he asked to do. He wasn't a medical doctor. He was a doctor of engineering, but at least he had the common sense to say, well, let's have a look. And about a year or so later, the same gentleman at the Center for UFO Studies who sent me that file contacted me on email. And he said, Philip, I've been rooting through some files today. I'm sure you've got these, but I thought I would send them to you anyway. And hey, presto, it was the photographs to go with that document. So here we had, photographs of Charlie's arm with these marks on it and Calvin's foot. And we know who's who because they were photographs. So they wrote the names on the back of them. And they were both scanned back and front. Now, they're only minor injuries. They're not some laser precise, cut marks or anything. They are, very much, but nonetheless, we have the document and we have the testimony from the two people involved. So there is a physical aspect to this encounter. And, I was stunned by it. I thought this is amazing. Now, one of the other things that happened, Calvin was interviewed by a local journalist. She's called Karen Nelson. And she also at the same time made a little film. So when she put the article online, there was a little film you could watch about it as well. Somebody took that and put it on YouTube. And one of the comments underneath it, I'm reading through them. There was a lot, but one said, my mum and dad were on the opposite side of the river that night, and they too saw the UFO. So I managed to find this person on social media. It was a young lady. I left her a message. I explained who we were, what we were doing, and could we speak to her parents? She said, I'll ask. She came back and said, yeah, they'll talk to you. And it was Mr. and Mrs. Blair, Jerry and Maria. Mr. Blair worked out offshore on the oil rigs, and they were on the opposite side of the river that night in the car by a little pier. There was a boat at the end of it, and that boat was going to take him out to go work. But his boss was late. So they sat in the car. He wasn't in the best of moods because he wanted to get out there. It was going to be a long night. And it was dark, but there was a full moon shining. So eventually they decided to get out of the car, you know, and Maria said, we saw this blue thing come down the river, and then it stopped opposite us on the other side of the river, and it was either lost or it was looking for something. She knew it wasn't an airplane because she knew there's no airfield over there, and an airplane doesn't move like that. So they decided to walk along this pier to take Mr. Blair's belongings and put it on this little boat. As they're walking down it, there's a huge splash in the river next to her. And this thing came up out of the river, and Maria said it was a grey man. And it came right up to her, and then went back into the water and under and was gone. And she said at this point, it was around about 9 o'clock at night. She wasn't sure, but it was around about 9 o'clock. She ran down and threw the things on the boat. Then she had to go back down the pier. And she was terrified, but she nonetheless did. But when she got to her car, it was midnight. So there was, and she said, I spoke to her on the phone, and she said, I've often wondered, Philip, if something similar didn't happen to me and Jerry, like it did to Charlie and Calvin. I said, why do you say that, Maria? And she had these little flashes. She says, it's almost if I can see something out of my peripheral vision and I can't quite make it out. I said, okay. So I spoke to Jerry, and he wasn't in the best of moods when I spoke to him. But he said he'd seen this blue thing. And so I passed this on to my colleague, Dr. Irina Scott, because it's easier for her to keep in touch with these people. Being in America, she lives in Ohio. We started working together. Slowly but surely, Maria provided Dr. Scott with more information. Then Jerry became ill, seriously ill. I mean, he wasn't sure if he was going to live or not. And he said to his wife, Maria, I got to tell you something. She says, what? And he says, we too were abducted that night. And despite his illness, she said to him, you got some talking to do, mister. So he said that night, 3 creatures got a hold of him. By the way he told her, it sounded like that this had happened before, because Jerry said, I was only trying to protect you. That was my only thoughts. And these little flashes that she had, she could now make sense of when he's starting to tell her the story. And Jerry did end up in hospital, and he was going to have an operation and wasn't sure if he was going to survive. So while he was in the hospital, he quite literally said to her, get your phone out. I want to phone Philip now. And he phoned me while he's in the hospital, and he said, call me Mr. Mantle. He said, I lied. He said, I saw the blue UFO. He called it the grey humanoid. And he said, same as my wife did. And he made Maria film him as well. So we have this little cell phone film of him sitting on his hospital bed with no shirt on. He's still got the little electrodes on because he's had an ECG. Thankfully, he survived the operation, but it was only a temporary fix, And right up until he died sometime later, he was still telling Maria about what had happened, right? So it was kind of like a deathbed confession, but it lasted over a longer period of time. So once the dust had settled after Mr. Blair died, Maria asked about hypnosis. She knew Calvin and Charlie had been under hypnosis. And I said, I'm 3,000 miles away on the other side of the Atlantic, So we left it. And then she came back to us again. And I said, okay, I'll see what I can do. So I found some local practitioners in the area. And there was one lady, a professional hypnotherapist. Her name is Crystal Slaughter. She agreed. We had to pay her a small fee. But not only did she agree, she said, I'll come to your house if you like. You don't have to come to my studio, I'll come there. So we arranged to have it at Calvin's house. Maria had met Calvin and they become friends. So the one thing we didn't do is we didn't tell the hypnotherapist anything. All she knew was a date, time, and a location. So October the 11th, Pascagoula River, 9 o'clock at night. So she put Maria under hypnosis. I also had it filmed professionally. And Maria started talking about what had happened that night. You should have seen the look on the face of the hypnotherapist. I think she was expecting anything but, what Maria came out with.
Yeah.
Anything but aliens.
Yeah. And Maria said, they were interested in her DNA and her eggs. And we ended the session. And so Calvin felt vindicated, but Maria wasn't alone. There were other witnesses on the river that night. Back in 1973, the river was a drawbridge. You had to open it to let the ships go under, and it had to be done manually. So there was a guy on duty there and pressed the button. And there was somebody on duty that night, but didn't see anything. So people criticized Charlie and Calvin, saying surely the bridge tender would have seen something. We spoke to a gentleman called Charles Rusty Anderson, and Mr. Anderson said, well, I was driving over the bridge that night with my wife. And he said, I saw this blue thing again, not in the sky above him, but actually down below. He said, I thought it was that low. I said, I thought it was going to crash. The next day, he drove to his aunt's who lived down by the river. And he said, as soon as I got there, she says to me, you'll never believe what I saw last night. And of course, he'd seen it as well. And then Calvin was doing a book signing in Pascagoula. And an elderly gentleman came up and said, can I have a book, please? And and he's talking, thank you very much. And he's talking to Calvin's wife, Waynette, and another lady. And he said, oh, by the way, I saw that thing that night. But then he walked away and we didn't know who he was. But thankfully, somebody took a photograph. So we have this gentleman buying the book. So I put that on social media and we found him and he spoke to us. He was a chap called Mr. Lewis Lee. He was working in the shipyard on the other side of the river. And he says, Philip, I was a crane driver. And he says, my cab was about 10 or 12 feet off the ground. And he said, you got an amazing view all around you. That's why the cab was so high. Mm-hmm. And he said, I saw this damn thing out over the water. Again, not up in the sky, high above it, out over the river. And he watched it for quite some time. And he said, I can't do a Mississippi accent. I'm sorry. I'm all on to do an English one, but, but he said, I've never seen anything like that damn thing. And he said, the only reason I took my eyes off it because my colleague down below, couldn't see it from his position, shouted up saying, what the hell are you doing? And so I said, this will give you an idea. I said to Mr. Lee, did you report it to anyone? He says, Philip, this is 1973. There is no Ghostbusters to call, He said, I told my family about it. I said, I didn't hide it, but then I didn't shout it from the rooftops either, So we have collected more and more witnesses and evidence like these, and all these that I'm talking about now are all in the book, of course, including the complete transcript of Maria Blair's hypnosis. What was interesting, we used the same hypnotherapist a few weeks later with Calvin Parker. Now, Calvin had been under hypnosis before. He knows the routine. By now, the hypnotherapist knows a little bit about what we're talking about. So I give her some questions to ask Calvin. So the first question was, when they stood there fishing, they're facing out to the water, can you just ask Calvin when he's under hypnosis what he sees in front of him? So she does. Calvin said, well, there's the bridge. He says, there's a little boat going out. He could even tell me the company name on the side of the boat. He could read it. There's the shipyard, blah, 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 blah. And he said, oh, right at the end. And if you don't listen, you'll miss it. He says, there's two people on the other side of the river. Now, are those two people Mr. and Mrs. Blair? Or are they somebody else? We'll never know. But it was just a little throwaway thing he said right at the end of that particular sentence. And again, we had this filmed, and the full transcript is in the book, and nothing's edited, you know. So the case just grew bigger and bigger and bigger. Sadly, you know, Mr. Blair did pass away, but Maria is still there, and we're still working on it. Quite literally, this morning when I got up, I have an email from a gentleman who was a local journalist at the time, and he got a tip off. So he was there the next morning, and he got an interview with Charlie and Calvin. Now, he said he filmed it on 16mm film. That probably doesn't exist. But he got an interview with them the morning after. I've just asked him to tell me what happened. You know, what did they say, how they were, what I know the answer, but, you know, so even other people that were there at the time who didn't necessarily see anything. For example, we tracked down the doctor who examined them at the Singing River Hospital. And Irina interviewed him twice. You know, he's since passed away. So we've, you know, the police dispatcher who was on duty that night, he took the call from Charlie. And we communicated with him. And he said, I took at least 50 calls that night from people reporting UFO sightings. And he said, when my shift was finished back at the police station, there were other people there reporting it in person. So it just gives you some idea of how things have grown, and they've grown even since our book was published. So there'll be more to come, and I can assure you. Wow. So it's a much bigger case than we ever imagined. Any questions?
Wow. Yeah, a lot. First, did you say there was or was not a military base nearby? There was.
Yeah, it's still there. It's Keesler Air Force Base.
Okay. And
they were interviewed there. And like I said, it was all done, all recorded by a stenographer. And we have that complete transcript. And that is in full in the book. There's all the officers' names, everybody that was there, you know, and nothing is redacted, and they tell the story. And this is literally the day after, you know. We also have the recording of Charles Hickson at the sheriff's department that night. So you hear the other voices asking him the questions. That is either the sheriff or one of his deputies. It's not great quality, so you have to listen carefully. But we have it, and so this is within hours of it happening. He's sat there in the sheriff's office telling them what's happened. You know, and of course, when Dr. James Harder arrived on the scene, he put both guys under hypnosis. And we have the hypnosis that he did with Calvin. It's only about 11 minutes long, and again, it's not great quality, but if you listen carefully, you can make it out. And we've uncovered all kinds of other things, you know, quite literally.
Has the military ever came out with a position on it as, you know, as a
no, I mean,
or...
no, not at all. We other researchers were in touch with Keesler before us, and all they did was confirm that they checked them for radiation, which was 0. You know, all they did was wave the Geiger counter over them. You know, nothing. There was no written report about that. They just said we did it, and then there is the transcript, you know, and I've since contacted the Air Force Base and asked them other questions, and they said we have no knowledge of anything like that, you know. So no, they didn't come. But what is interesting, just a few weeks later, on November the 6th, 1973, in the same stretch of water, but just a little further out, it's a bit deeper, there were 3 fishing boats. Just local people fishing. And they saw this thing under the water. It was round. They said it was segmented like the old Second World War parachutes. And it was illuminated. It was about 30 feet in diameter, so it's not small. They got close enough to it to hit it with an oar, and it went clunk. Then the lights would go out, and they would appear somewhere else. So they played cat and mouse with it. So in the end, they went in person to the Coast Guard office and reported it. the Coast Guard sent a boat out. They too saw it, and they too hit it with an oar, and it went clunk. And what we have in the book is all the official documents that the Coast Guard put together about this incident. And they say in it was unidentified. And they even mention the witnesses. So again, there's nothing redacted. We even have a handwritten letter by one of the Coast Guard officers as well. So when we were working on this, a colleague said, you know, I think there was 8 fishermen in these 3 little boats that night. He said, so-and-so has got a photograph of them. They were asked to come down the next morning, and a guy from the Navy came, and they lined them up on the quayside and took a photograph of them. It's in colour. And again, on the back is all their names, so you know who's who. So I got a copy of it, and I put this on social media. Within a couple of hours, a lady had contacted me, and she said, all of them are dead apart from one. And then she said, I'm related to him via marriage. I think it was a father-in-law or something of that nature. And it was a chap called Earl Ryan. He was only 16 at the time. She put us in touch with Mr. Ryan. Irina, spoke to him, interviewed him on the phone. So we have his up-to-date thoughts and everything in the book as well. But he said a guy did come from the Navy the next day, and we had to show him where it happened. And they thought the Navy guy's a bit dumb because there's nothing to show. It's just the water, it's just the river. There's nothing there now. But I read elsewhere in newspaper reports about this incident that the Navy was supposed to be putting a report together, but we've never found that. Now, whether it was or was not put together, I have no idea. And, I've tried Freedom of Information Act requests and what have you, but drawn a complete blank. They may not have put a report together. It may be as simple as that. But it's a fascinating account that happened just shortly afterwards in the same stretch of water. And even the Coast Guard in these official documents, they're all there, said it could not identify it. Amazing. So again, there was lots of other things going on. Even the Sheriff Fred Diamond, who interviewed Charlie and Calvin that night, had his own UFO sighting 2 days later. And that made one of the local papers.
Wow.
So there you go.
Did you ever find out who leaked it, by the way?
No. It was the one big thing, apart from what happened that night, was the one big thing that always puzzled Calvin. I never got a chance to speak to Charlie because he died in 2011. And he came up with an idea that it might have been one of those guys that has a piece of equipment that can listen into the calls that are made to the police. A scanner.
Scanner, yeah.
And he wondered if somebody hadn't, because they phoned the police, and that was patched through to the sheriff's department. And so that was the only idea he came up with. Initially, they blamed the sheriff because apart from them two, it was either the sheriff or the deputy were the only two that knew, But Sheriff Fred Diamond said, no, it wasn't us. And Charlie hadn't leaked it because Calvin was back home with him, So we never found out, and we probably never will. But you just don't know. And, there's some vintage recordings of interviews done with the sheriff, and they believed them, And like I said, the deputy who was on duty that night, Glenn Ryder, said several times that if these guys were acting, they ought to be in Hollywood. He said, especially the young guy, Calvin Parker, he said he would talk about frightened, And Charlie said, I was in combat in Korea. I'm pinned down by enemy gunfire, and I've seen people scared. But I've never seen anybody as scared as Calvin was that night. So wow. Yeah, that's the Pascagoula case. There's a lot more. There's more witnesses, but that should give you a good flavor of what we've uncovered.
Yeah,
oh,
definitely.
That's quite a bit.
And that's all in our book, Beyond Reasonable Doubt, The Pascagoula Alien Abduction. It's on Amazon. You can get it in a variety of sizes. You can get it as a Kindle. It's even an audio book.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's good, because when I started publishing books, it was just straightforward. But a gentleman contacted me and said, I'm a long distance truck driver. And he said, I quite often have an audio book playing rather than music. And he says, when I sometimes have to park my trailer up to sleep, I'll listen to an audio book, And he said, any chance of you doing audiobooks, Philip? So I looked into it, and we've managed to do that. So what we're also looking at doing later this year is I'm writing another book about it, is that we'll do an audiobook that will include as many of the hypnosis sessions as possible. So you'll be able to hear to the original recording.
Nice.
That'd be awesome.
Some of them are not good enough quality, so they will be narrated. But the others, where we can, I mean, I've got colleagues working on that now. They will have the full audio recordings. And again, make your own mind what you think of them.
Sure. Have you worked with any other abductees?
Yeah. I mean, my first book back in 1994 was called Without Consent. And it was all about abduction cases in the UK. So there were a few that I kept in touch with down the years, still we'll call on friendly terms, so to speak. And what was interesting when Carl and I wrote that book is we asked a number of the abductees, what do you think happened to you? What you had these experiences, not me. What do you think happened? And it's amazing how different they were. Some said, definitely, we think it's beings from another world. Others thought it was some kind of spiritual experience. Others said, I haven't got a clue, Philip. That's why I became to you, One young guy, although he didn't honestly believe this, he thought it was the Russians, because this happened in the 1980s and the Russians were the bad guys. So, and it was technology. So the only bad guys were the Russians. But it helped him deal with it,
Sure.
So yeah, and I every now and again there's still one of these who was featured in that original book. We communicate via email now, and I'll drop her an email, say how you going, everything. Yeah, and she'll chat about a family and a business, and how you going, Philip? What you doing? So yeah, and I've interviewed a lot of them down the years.
Do you think that, I think especially for Calvin, that has helped them make peace with what's happened?
Absolutely. I mean, Calvin was totally traumatized by this event, and I've used this to give people an idea. In the 1980s, there was a TV series called The Hulk. You're probably too young to remember it, but basically,
I do.
the Hulk and his alter ego, Dr. Banner, were hounded by a journalist. So they go to a town, have an adventure. The journalist would almost catch up with them, and they'd move along. That happened to Calvin in real life. Not on a TV show. He would literally, the moment he was recognized, pack up with a young family as well and move. And his wife Waynette, who was his fiancée at the time, was none too pleased. There was even one occasion he got fired. His boss called him into the office and said, "You're fired." He said, "What for? I haven't done anything wrong." Calvin had used a false name, and his name didn't match his social security number. So he tried to explain to his boss and said, "I don't care. You should have just told me the truth. You're fired, And in the end, when Calvin wrote his book, that kind of lifted a big weight off his shoulders, because he'd now told his story. And as I pointed out to him, if anybody wanted to know about it, you could say, just point to your book. It's not a commercial thing. You just say it's all in the book. Mm-hmm. And he was treated with respect. Then when others started coming out of the woodwork and saying, hang on a minute, Calvin, I saw it that night as well. And then the Blairs,
crazy.
Well, he thought this was vindication for him, and he was a tough old guy, and when they unveiled the historical marker, we have him on film. He was interviewed by the local news media. Calvin's actually absolutely in tears. Oh. He could not believe it, you know. And it wasn't just about Calvin, the markers for Calvin and Charlie. Charlie was no longer with us, but his son Eddie came along. Calvin knows Eddie, so his family was represented as well, and rightfully so. And for example, we interviewed Eddie for our book. And because we knew how this had affected Calvin and his family, but we didn't know how it affected Charlie's family. And Eddie told us about that. And he said, you know, his mum was more scared than anybody because she kept looking over her shoulder and thinking, is this going to happen again? You know? Yeah. So his mum, you know, Charlie's wife, was more scared than Charlie, you know? So it all started with me wanting an interview with Calvin. That's all I wanted. And if he'd have given me that interview and not said anything else, none of this would probably have happened. But it did. And the case just got bigger and bigger. And it's still, like I said, a gentleman just contacted me today, said he was a local journalist, only a young fella. He got a tip off about it. What I want to know is who tipped him off.
Yeah. Because
that might lead us to how the story got out in the first place. Yeah. We're not wanting to blame anybody. We're just wanting to try and figure it out. For example, 2 days after the event, Hynek arrived on the scene. Literally. And Calvin said, I don't know how the hell he got there so quick, because they lived in Illinois. So he said the story didn't come out until the next day. And then the following day, Hynek's there. I found out in a book that Dr. Hynek was part of a documentary that was being made, and he was already en route to New York to take part in it. So as soon as he got to New York, the story broke. They paid him for his his flight and his hotel down to Pascagoula. So he was already en route from Illinois. So he's, you know, so we found that was an answer to a little question there. It's not earth shattering. It's not, you know, but it just fills in little gaps.
Yeah.
Yeah. Pieces of the puzzle.
When did you start all the research into this?
Well, I started as soon as Calvin started writing his book. What Calvin and I did, we worked on a layout of the book first, how it would look, what chapters, what he would talk about. So Calvin would write a piece, he'd send it to me. I'd say, right, I need a bit more info about this, please. I don't know what you mean here. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? And eventually we'd end up with a finished chapter. And nothing was accepted without Calvin's permission. If he didn't give it the green light, then it didn't happen. So we go through. So I was looking for documentary evidence because Calvin, I just suspected he'd have some. I never thought about hurricanes. We don't have them here, you know.
Yeah.
But of course, what I found out is that the police department also suffered in that. So they lost all their documentation. I mean, you know, so I started right away, primarily looking for interviews, newspaper cuttings, photographs, basically anything. I've been involved in this subject for a long time, so I knew a lot of people around the world anyway. So I knew how to ask politely and say, look, I'm working on this. Have you got any of this? And I was amazed what we could find. You know, I was totally, this technology again that we have in front of us enabled me to go and find things in archives. And, you know, they were even interviewed the following day by NBC. The whole interview you can obtain via NBC if you want. I got a little clip of it that I could download, but it's there. And, you know, so we just kept finding. So I started on my hunt. We knew there were a couple of witnesses at the time. We knew we found them, but it just grew bigger and bigger and bigger. I'll give an example, another example of another witness. When Calvin's book came out, I was contacted by a gentleman in Greece, and it's called Stefanos Panagiotakis. And in 1981, so 8 years after the event, Stefanos was in the Greek merchant navy as a radio operator, but he was also a UFO researcher and used to write for a magazine in Greece. And his favorite case was the Pascagoula case And in 1981, his ship docked in Pascagoula and he got a week's shore leave. And he thought, fantastic, I want an interview with Charlie Hickson. So he found Charlie, got an interview with him. Stephanos also went to the police station, said, can you help me? And they said, you need to go and interview Pastor Emmanuel Sigalas. He saw something that night. And Mr. Sigalas is also of Greek extract, So he gave him his address. So Stephanos went to this gentleman's house, knocked on the door, introduced himself, and Pastor Sigalas gave him an interview. And of course, Stephanos still had it. He got a transcript of it, which he provided me. So what happened that night, again, it's October the 11th, 1973, same night as the abduction. The pastor, Sigalas, a chap called Don Broadhurst, who worked with the police and probation department, and a young lady were heading out of Pascagoula to a church-sponsored event that helped people with alcohol problems. This lady in the back was a church volunteer. And as they're driving out, she's looking out of the passenger window and she sees this thing coming. And she alerts them to it. And it went right across the road in front of them. And they even drew a picture of it.
Wow.
Now, by the time, 2018 came around and Stephanos told us this story, Mr. Sigalas and Mr. Broadhurst were now deceased. But nonetheless, we had Stephanos' interview. Mm-hmm. I think they said, hang on a minute, what about the young lady in the back of the car? We found her name. And she was called Joanne Hallmark. She wasn't a native of Pascagoula. She'd worked there for a couple of years in the high school, and she was a local church volunteer. Now, I found a couple of social media accounts that she had, but they hadn't been used in years. They were dead and gone. I left messages, nothing. So I kind of forgot about it. I kept the name. We even found an old black and white photo of her. And then at some point, I went back and revisited it. And I looked on one of these social media accounts, and it mentioned a church. So what I did, I Googled the church. And there it was. And it wasn't in Mississippi. It was in Maryland. And this church had a website. So I goes on the website and I'm looking through it. And there's even some sermons that you could download. And these sermons were told by two men called Hallmark. And I'm thinking, is that her husband? Is it her son's? Now, the church had a generic email address, info@church, whatever. So I emailed them, explained I was looking for the lady, explained where she'd worked. I didn't mention anything about UFOs. I said, if she's still around, could you just pass my message on, please? About 3 or 4 weeks later, she replied, confirmed she'd worked in Pascagoula with Pastor Sigalas back in 1973. Then I replied and told her what I was looking at, what. And again, it took her a few weeks, but she responded and confirmed everything. She gave me a phone number. Again, my colleague, Dr. Irina Scott, phoned her, interviewed her on the telephone. She gave us all the details. She even sent me an up-to-date photograph because I sent her the black and white one from 1974. And that made her chuckle, So here's a lady who didn't step forward. We used some detective work to find her, and she was quite happy to confirm what she witnessed that night back in 1973. And it was pretty much exactly as Pastor Sigalas had explained in his 1981 interview. There were a couple of small discrepancies, but nothing major. So there were people out there who said, oh, these witnesses are just stepping forward to get their own 5 minutes of fame, Well, this lady didn't step forward. We found her, and we managed to trace her. And we did that with a few others as well. So I'll just give you an idea. What Stephanos did, he drove out of the town where the pastor said we're going, and he took a photograph through the car window, had the photograph printed, and the pastor drew the UFO on the photograph, and we have a copy of that. So We have the location and what it looked like. And it was heading in the general direction of where Charlie and Calvin were down by the river. You know, you can never say 100% that's where it was going, but it was in that general direction.
True.
So there you go. Another witness that's, again, is in the book.
That's crazy. Well,
And
I don't know if that's
really
the right
tells
word,
you,
but
Well,
tells you how
we
far
were
technology's
stunned.
gone.
Yeah, we were stunned. And, you know, Calvin used to say, I don't know what's going to crop up next. So you know, Dr. Scott and I were just researching this. We didn't plan a book. And every time we made some new discoveries, we'd write an article. And I said, you know, we can only write so many articles about this. And we got all this other information accumulating. So we decided to put it all in a book. Calvin gave us his blessing. He said, I'll write the foreword for you. Great. And we had this working title for the book, and we didn't like it. And I was sat watching the TV one night, and there was a courtroom drama on. And it said, we have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that this guy's innocent, you know. And I thought, bingo, that's the title of the book. And I emailed Irene, and she said, yep. Because what we say at the end, we're not going to say that Charlie and Calvin were abducted by aliens. What we say is, in our humble opinion, if we were able to take all this evidence and all these witnesses into a courtroom, we could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that something quite extraordinary happened that night. We'll never be able to prove exactly what it was, but it certainly wasn't no balloon, no helicopter, you know, no aeroplane, no drone, you know. So hence, beyond reasonable doubt for the title of the book. And
I love that.
yeah, I mean, I've been involved in 40 some years. I never thought it's almost the perfect case.
Yeah.
I say almost because we don't have any photographs of the events that evening. That would never surprise me if one didn't crop up. Don't get me wrong, but in all the years I've been involved, I never found anything like this. If you think about the other major abduction cases, Betty and Barney Hill and Travis Walton, they're the main two. Betty and Barney Hill didn't have hypnosis for years after the event. And most of what they say is based on the hypnotic testimony. There's no independent eyewitnesses. Same with Travis Walton. You know, although his colleagues in the truck saw the UFO and the beam of light, nobody saw anything else. You know, so there's more to come. That's all I can say. And yeah. And when we were writing the book, we were also conscious of today's economic climate, you know, because it affects all of us. So we made the book available in different sizes, different formats. So hopefully there's something there for everyone's wallet. You know, there's a small paperback that's 9x6, and there's a hardback, there's a big hardback, there's a Kindle, there's an audio book. And yes, I'm biased, but I said to myself, if I still read UFO books, and I thought if there were only one book I could afford this year, this is the one I would buy, you know. And I'm not one to brag or boast, but that's just how I see it. And I think in years to come, when I'm no longer here, it will be looked on as a landmark publication. That's what I feel about it. Much like I feel about Bud Hopkins' first book called Missing Time. I'd recommend that to anyone interested in this aspect of the subject matter. I feel the same about this book.
Yeah, very good book.
Yeah, it seems like it, you know, despite some of those missing pieces, it comes pretty darn full circle.
Yeah, and, you know, Calvin felt totally vindicated. You know, he didn't do it, but this was the middle finger to all those that had laughed at him and Charlie back in the 1970s and called them, you know, drunken hicks and drunken rednecks, or they were on. I mean, it's a stupid thing to say they were drunk. I don't know about you two, but when I was a young fella, I've been drunk many times. You know, my family were Irish and they could drink, you know. but I never had any kind of hallucination about anything. I had amnesia a few times, you know. So getting drunk does not cause you to hallucinate an alien abduction. That's what I'm trying to say.
Not unless they were mixing some kind of crazy stuff together, but I highly doubt that.
But even if there were, we have third parties around the area. I'll give you another example. I mentioned Mr. Anderson, who was driving over the bridge that night, and he saw the thing down below him.
Mm-hmm.
He was interviewed for the Netflix documentary, so he's on it. So when he was interviewed, he just put a little post on Facebook, been interviewed, you know. And there was a few comments underneath, and there was a lady with a completely different name. She said, "Oh, I saw that thing that night." Words to that effect. So I sent her a message. Could we speak to you? Yeah. She's called Mrs. Eves. And again, Irina got the phone number, and Irina interviewed her on the phone. What she says to us, so if you imagine Charlie and Calvin are on the river, to the left is the bridge. So you have Mr. Anderson over. You've got almost right opposite you the shipyard with Lewis Lee, and then bit over from there you've got the Maria and Jerry Blair. To your right, about a mile away, she's not far. You had this lady, she called Pamela Rayleigh Eves. And she said, I went to put the children to bed, and I went to close the bedroom curtains, and it looks out in the direction of the river. And we saw this blue thing. So we interviewed her and thanked her. She's actually the cousin of Mr. Anderson. She didn't know that he'd seen something, and vice versa. Again, yeah, so she's in the book as well. You know, so we have Charlie and Calvin on the pier, and we've got people dotted all around him, almost like a semicircle in front of them, all seeing something that night. So even if they were taking illegal substances, these other people would not be party to that. They're all independent pretty much, you know. Yeah. So and they're all in the book. And we've interviewed more witnesses since the book was published, of course. We've interviewed others. Make of it what you will.
Well, it sounds to me like you've proven it beyond a shadow of a doubt. And as a paramedic, I can say, yeah, I've seen a lot of drunks. I've seen a lot of high people. I've only had 2 people in my entire career talk about anything in aviation, and they were both pilots.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Yeah, it's I don't believe it was the alcohol or drunken rednecks, especially with all that information. It also makes you wonder how many other people saw it and either don't remember it or they just don't want to say.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've down these last 5 or 6 years, I've noticed on certain Facebook pages there's been a discussion about it, and a number of people have made little comments, said, "Yeah, I saw it that night." But, you know, I've contacted them and they didn't respond. So I'm going to leave them alone. They don't want to talk about it. That's fine. So we know there are other people that have seen it that declined an interview. And that's fine. We're no problem with that. I think there's only 2 people in the book where we don't actually use their real names. Everybody else said it's fine. You know, what we always ask that question. We'll keep them in complete confidence if required. You know, that's not a problem. So we know there are other people, and because it was a nice popular area where they were. Behind them, you know, was dwellings. There was some businesses, and then there's Highway 90, and there's, you know, people living there.
Yeah.
And this is not like Roswell out in the middle of the desert. This is not in the swamps of Mississippi. This is right next to Highway 90. You know.
Well, that makes you wonder how many other people besides like just Charlie and Calvin and the Blairs that might have.
Well, who knows? You know, who knows? What we will say, if there's anybody listening to this today, you know, and if you were party to this, if you were there and you did witness something, please get in touch. And like I say, we'll keep your identity secret if that's what you want. And I'm sure, you know, we're working on 2 more documentaries. They will be finished and be out this year. There'll be another book this year and one next year. And that should bring it kind of all up to date, unless something else happens in the meantime.
Have you followed any of the other more recent ones? I mean, there's the Miami Mall in the U.S., and then there's the teenager in, I think it was Las Vegas somewhere, that had the incident. Have you followed any of those? Or
I've seen. I haven't gotten involved in them. Let's put it that way. I follow a lot of things, but I still research other things, not just Pascagoula. Because I've been involved in the subject for so long, other things just drop into my inbox, and I deal with that. I'm dealing with a gentleman now who doesn't live here, so I'm close by, so I can't interview him in person, but he's had a number of sightings down the years, and I find them quite fascinating, and he's telling them for his first time. He's 80 years of age, and I've written another book for next year that's got nothing to do with Pascagoula, although it is mentioned in one chapter. And this is called UFO Reflections. It's not finished yet, but it will be. And this is all the other stuff that I've been involved with down the years. I've done all kinds of things. I said to my wife, I'm not writing any more books. And she said, well, what about all the other stuff you've got sat on your computer? So I thought, well, it's your fault. This book now is your fault. If you don't complain to me that I'm spending too long in the office writing about it, So that will come out next year. That's almost finished, but that's all kinds of stuff, all different stuff. So,
what are your thoughts on what supposedly happened in Miami?
Don't know. I don't know enough about it, so I'll not comment. I'll leave others that are there on the ground. That's one of the things we must learn in this subject. If somebody's already dealing with it, leave it alone. Let them get on with it. We can all comment on it. You'll see it on Twitter and Facebook. Yeah, we can make our comments, but allow the people who are there to get on with the investigation. What you don't want is people from all over the world all piling in at the same time. And then when the results of the investigation come out, if you don't agree with them and you decide to look into it, that's fine, but let people get on with it. There are still active UFO researchers and UFO groups. Let them get on with their work.
Yeah, I watched a thing on, I think it was the Fox News channel local there in Vegas. I think it's Vegas, wherever the one was where they had the actual body cameras from the police. And police officers running. I saw the news there, and apparently the most recent activity is they've had some paranormal activity at the house.
Yeah.
He's now saying that the teenager that first saw this creature is saying that he thinks it was a demon, and he said, but the thing that's worst out of the entire thing is, he says, I came forward. He says there's at least 4 people a day that come to my house. Well, so they've had to hire people to basically keep people away.
Well, that happened to Charlie and Calvin. There were literally people would just turn up on the doorstep, almost demanding that they tell them the story. Yeah, these weren't necessarily journalists, but I'll give you another idea of how things work. I mean, a couple of years back, I did a TV documentary, and a local gentleman to where I live emailed me. And he said, I've got something I want to show you. Can I come and meet you? I'm always wary about people coming to the house that I don't know. But nonetheless, he came. He was about the same age as me. And this wasn't anything he'd got. It was his father-in-law, who was now deceased, on his wife's side, obviously. And he had written a little memoir. And he'd done it himself, on the computer. Printed it off. He'd only done half a dozen copies. And the area where we live all around here used to be all coal mining. It's all gone now, but it was a huge coal mining area. My father worked down the mine all his life. This gentleman had been a mining engineer. So he would build the lift shafts and the lifting gear that bring people up and down and all that kind of thing. So this book was in 2 parts. This memoir, I should say. First part is all about engineering in the mines, and this fella said, if you read it, it's the most boring thing you'll ever read in your life. The other part of it was all about him and his background and where he grew up. And he tells this story. I think it goes back to 1922. So it's between the First and Second World War. Well, he's a young kid. And him and his mate set off to go to the park one morning. This was in a day where you let your kids out on their own over here, you know. And on the way to the park, they came across this thing on the ground. And they walked up to it, and there's this almost human-looking being talks to them. He's dressed in fancy clothes. He's got a little turban on. He looks Oriental, Asian maybe. And they're invited on board. They're shown around. There's other beings there, and off they go again. And this part of the memoir is simply entitled The Encounter. And it's the biggest chapter in the whole memoir. And he'd never told a soul. He's dead and gone now. But he only wrote this up and printed it out for his family.
Wow.
I think this is 1922. So that will be in my new book next year, UFO Reflections. That will be in there. And so it just gives you an idea of what kind of things that I deal with other than Pascagoula.
Wow.
Well, a couple quick questions for you. Putting it together with other creatures, like other cryptids, like Bigfoot or, I don't know, skinwalkers or whatever, do you think there's any connection there to the UFOs?
No, not at all. No. What we tried to do, I mean, the creatures that Charlie and Calvin observed are unique to their encounter. You know, I've contacted colleagues around the world. I've got my own collection of books and magazines, and I've looked and looked and looked. Can't find anything remotely similar. So if Charlie and Calvin wanted to invent this story, there was plenty of imagery already available. You know, Betty and Barney Hill had already been told, you know, and so where the hell they would get these images from, I don't know. It would have been quite easy to just explain. And then Calvin complicates it by saying this other creature came in that looked almost human, you know?
Yeah.
So the answer to that is no. It's what happened to them that night with these beings is unique to their case. And unless somebody else out there knows differently, you know, it's never definitive. You know, that's what we know so far.
Okay. And I've also noticed a lot of people saying with these type of stories, there's a connection with a body of water. Have you noticed that trend yourself?
No, not at all. I mean, obviously they were fishing that night, so, you know, they're near water. But no, I mean, UFO encounters, sightings, they're here, there, and everywhere. And certainly like a small country that we live in, not you. You don't live in a small country. I've been across America, and every time I got off the airplane, I had to change my watch, and it was a different time. We don't have that here. So if you pick a map out of the UK, you can literally connect it with pretty much anything, because it's such a small country, you know, where you use your own bias to say, well, it's near a river. Well, of course it's near a river. There's loads of them, you know. Yeah. Oh, it's near an airport. Well, yeah, it's a small country. So, but the point is, when you try and put these things to connect with certain things, you have to remember that the information that we have is only partial. We don't have the full picture. Because we know through experience there are lots of people who have these encounters, don't report them. People who have UFO sightings don't report them. So when you're trying to connect it with anything, you're dealing with, you know, only half the data, maybe less than that. So whatever conclusion you may come to is wrong, basically, because you haven't got all the info. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. You can't complete it unless you've got all the pieces, and we certainly don't have all the pieces.
I was a flight paramedic for many years, and I never got over to Europe. Well, I did get to Ireland, take that back. But all the pilots and people I worked with, we would talk, you know, chatting when you're downtime and stuff. And one night I brought up the UFOs because they know I was big into the Bigfoot thing. And one of the pilots says, well, if we ever see anything, we're never going to say anything. So what do you mean? He says, because they will take our license from us, our certification, and say we are nuts. He said, so most pilots won't talk about it. And
No,
he was absolutely right.
But there are some that do.
Yes.
And of course, what happens to them? Nothing.
I think it's just a fear from that 50s era where everybody still is, it's in the back of their head. You're a nutter. You're crazy. So
yeah. But I'll give you an example. I spoke to a wing commander, Alan Turner, MBE, and Wing Commander Turner had top secret security classification, and he was in charge of military radar here in the UK. And he was on duty one night. His clearance was so high that when the U-2 spy plane came into the UK, which it did to refuel, he was notified about it. And that was the most secret aircraft on the planet. And he was on duty one night, and they got 6 targets over mainland UK that they could not identify. And it was checked by both civil and other military installations. And he phoned the Ministry of Defence straight away, and they demanded, not asked, that he fill out a full report straight away. And he did. And nothing happened to him. And we only got to hear about it quite by chance. But once we did, he told me in full. And he said, Philip, I can tell you, I can give you a list of things that these 6 objects were not. But I can't tell you what they were. I have no idea. And he literally said, it's not this. They had 2 types of radar. And he said they weren't going that fast that way, but the rate of climb was unbelievable, And basically, 2 friends of mine had been to a little UFO meeting. And they were in the pub afterwards, standing at the bar, having a drink, talking about it. Wing Commander Turner was sat on a table next to them, and he overheard their conversation. And he told them his story. They got his contact details, and they told me. And I contacted him. I've met him as well. And nothing happened to him. He was, like I say, he got an MBE from the Queen eventually and retired. And, so I don't know where this story comes from about pilots getting bad things happen to them, because I can't find one that ever has, but that's just an example. And Wing Commander Turner's encounter will be in my book, UFO Reflections, next year.
Awesome. I look forward to it.
Very cool.
Yeah. I try and read a few a year. And so,
well, I'll keep you stocked up for the next couple of years then, won't I?
Yeah, well, you will. Yeah, absolutely. So I don't think I've actually had any from, from overseas, but I mean, from this.
Shame on you. Shame on you.
Well, I went down the Bigfoot hole, so I got stuck in the Bigfoot hole. And just like everybody wondering with the UFOs, what's the phenomenon? We still don't know what a Bigfoot is. And 90%, well, I won't say 90, but a large portion of the people say he doesn't exist.
Well, it's not something I've looked into. I know what Bigfoot is, but there's no Bigfoot in Britain. We're too small for anything like that. Far too small, So there's nothing to worry about in that. I remember being in the States and speaking to a gentleman there, and I had to explain to him that the most dangerous thing in Britain was probably a wasp. Because people get allergic to wasp stings and it makes them poorly. We have got nothing that will bite you or kill you. We just don't. And he couldn't believe it. He said, "What? You not got anything?" No, we have not got anything that will hurt you, really.
So unlike Australia, you go there and the plants will even try and kill you. So everything will get you there. Philip, it has been a pleasure talking to you, and I've kept you way longer than your time. And I appreciate you for doing that, and especially making the time, being that with the time zone difference. It's great.
That's my pleasure. Absolutely my pleasure.
It's been
it's
great hearing everything.
Yeah. And hopefully one day we'll put this puzzle all together and find out what all of these things are, that, beings from another planet, another dimension, aliens, angels, who knows?
Who knows? I certainly don't.
No, and I'm 55, and I doubt that in my lifetime we'll figure it out. So, hopefully my grandkids. But it is nice to see the I don't want to call it the awakening. So many people call it that, but it is nice to see that people are more open to things and ideas and coming out.
Yeah, let's hope it lasts. You know, these trends come and go, so let's hope it carries on.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Absolutely.
All right, Philip, before we cut out of here, any last things you want to say where people can find you? You got anything coming up besides for all your books?
Yeah, there's all kinds of things, you know, coming. I run Flying Disc Press. It's disc with a K. So that's just publishing. I publish books from people from here, there, and everywhere. And we've got new books coming out all the time. So keep your eyes open for that. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. I don't use Twitter that much, but I'm on there. Easily located. I'm not in some little hobbit place in the middle of Middle Earth, you know. West Yorkshire in the UK is not hard to find, you know. But I'm easily located. Let's put it that way.
Okay, very
All
good.
right.
And with your publication company, do you publish only UFO things, or do you publish?
I've done a couple. I've done a couple of paranormal books as well, but I try and stick mainly with the UFO topic because it's the topic I know best. And you know, if I delve into other areas, I'm a little bit out of my depth, so I'd rather not. But you know, I keep my mind open, and we'll see what happens in the future.
That's good. Cheyenne, any questions for him before we get him out of here?
Nope, I can't wait to start this book.
She loves the Audible books. I'm more of a Kindle person. So
Well, either way, you'll not be disappointed, I can assure you.
Oh, I can
I've got a
already tell you
bookshelf
that.
behind me of plenty of books, and in the basement I've got like 3 or 4 more of them. And my wife is like, "You're not getting any more books." So I'm now a Kindle person thanks to the missus. I know how that is. So, all right, Philip. Well, you have a great day. Thank you for allowing us to
Thank
come
you
into your
very
life,
much.
even for
Thank
just a
you.
brief time.
Oh, my pleasure.
We look forward to hearing. Keep in touch. We look forward to hearing any more news or anything exciting else you got to come out.
Absolutely.
And since this is recorded, I will let you know probably the next week we will run it, and it'll be on all the YouTubes and all the stuff. So
That's great. Thank you very
I'll
much.
send you a link.
Have a great day.
You too.
And
Same
I dare say
here.
we'll speak again, okay?
Absolutely.
Sir, we will. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye now.
Bye bye. That was a great interview.
I just want to hear him talk more.
Well, it is. Well, yes, because of the accent, but it is also fascinating to hear
Yes.
stories from
And he's a
other
great
places.
storyteller too.
He's a great storyteller, and you know the thing is, he is, I don't know, thousands of miles away
Yeah.
from something that happened in 1973. Time-wise, he's a long ways away, but he has put it together. I should have asked him if he had any type police or detective background, because he was almost like a detective in some of the aspects, the way he was getting the details. So,
Yeah.
all right. Well, we ran a little bit over. So I don't know. I may trim this a little bit and run this with Tommy for Nashville Friday, and I'll try and get this out over the weekend. In the meantime, Mondays we have the UFL with the Lip Men. Wednesdays are the Para OR Normal Guyz on YouTube. You can find it looking for the Sportcat shows. That throws everybody off now, but I changed it. And then Friday night we do a Grading Guardian show, which is public safety oriented. And then on Saturdays we kind of let our hair down, do the Misfits, and get a little crazy. So you can find us doing that. You can find me on the Thin Line Rock Station Tuesdays and Thursdays from noon till 2 Eastern, playing, I'll just say, hits. And I've started doing Flashback Fridays on the same thing, thinlineradio.com, thethinlineradio.com. So you can catch me there. We're also on Yerg's Radio, YERGZ radio.com. And you can catch our replays of some of our shows as well. So we're kind of everywhere. Not to mention, I didn't read up top here, WDJY in Atlanta, KUVO Denver, WRFN Nashville. We're kind of a big deal. So it's funny. I actually had somebody ask me the other day, he goes, well, I need to know exactly how many listeners do you have? I said, well, let me tell you where I am, and you see if you can figure that out, because I can't. Get back to me. So it's kind of hard to do. Cheyenne, anything coming up for you or what on?
No, tomorrow I'll be hanging out with bracket bastards, talking about boobs.
Great topic. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate you for tuning in for this special edition. Please like, follow, subscribe, and share. And as always, you can message us at Para OR Normal Guyz with a Z at gmail.com, or shoot us a voicemail at sportcat@protonmail.com. That's not a voicemail, that's my email. Speakpipe.com/sportcat. Whew. You can email me too, I don't care. Until then, ladies and gentlemen, we will talk to you soon.